Welcome to Independent Aircraft Investigations. My name is Richard Godfrey. Today we're going to investigate Air India, the AI171 crash, the first ever crash of a Boeing 787 just after takeoff from Ahmedabad Airport in India. This is episode 9, Innocent or Guilty. The Government of India, the Ministry of Civil Aviation, and the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau released a 15-page preliminary report 30 days after the accident. The accident occurred on the 12th of June, 2025. The report states there were 260 fatalities, 241 on board and 19 on the ground, and there were 67 injuries. The aircraft was destroyed, but remarkably, one passenger survived. The AAIB of India, in line with International Aviation Investigation Practice, ICAO Annex 13, explicitly stated that the purpose of the investigation is to prevent future accidents and not to apportion blame or liability. A number of viewers have made statements that the pilot or pilots are innocent, and other viewers have made statements that the pilot or pilots are guilty. Today, we investigate whether the pilot or pilots are innocent or guilty, or whether the cause was another and not initiated by either pilot. Independent Aircraft Investigations brings you the established facts. We provide traceability of all evidence to a source authority. We make a clear distinction between factual data and analytical interpretation. We are not party to the official investigation, and this report does not represent the views of any official body. We operationalize ICAO Annex 13 by embedding investigative discipline directly into the production of each episode. This ensures factual material, analytical work, and narrative outputs remain clearly distinguished, traceable, and compliant throughout the life cycle of an investigation. No final consensus exists until the final AAIB India accident report, which is typically published many months after a preliminary report and only after thorough analysis. Aviation news is covered on Daily Airline News with Jeffrey Thomas, as it happens. This channel is reserved exclusively for in-depth investigations. If you find this analysis useful and want to see future independent investigations, subscribing to the channel helps this work to continue. The Supreme Court of India agreed to hear public interest litigation and other related petitions seeking an independent or judicially monitored inquiry, rather than leaving the investigation solely to the AAIB. The court has issued notices to the government and other authorities and sought responses. The Supreme Court has not issued a final decision on the petition. Proceedings are continuing as the court examines arguments about transparency, independence of the investigation, and disclosure of critical flight data. The Supreme Court has issued an interim statement saying that no one in India believes it was the pilot. The Wall Street Journal published an article on the 11th of July 2025 preempting the preliminary report and says the pilots are the focus of the probe into the India crash. The investigation, it goes on, into last month's Air India crash is focusing on the action of the jet's pilots and doesn't so far point to a problem with the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, according to people familiar with the US officials' early assessments. On Daily Airline News with Jeffrey Thomas, we have published 120 episodes on Air India. In the previous episode, we presented an alternative explanation to the pilot error narrative. Here's a couple of viewer comments at Veritas 256. The preliminary report was a shoddy job, but done with intent to blame the dead pilots. The report does not officially identify the cause. However, why should a fragment of an alleged conversation be released? By releasing a fragmented sentence, the report has succeeded in casting aspersions on the pilots, and the media has done the rest. Highly unprofessional, and therefore the Indian Supreme Court had to intervene. And at Tony Greyhound, F4T, why did you cut off? Pilot thinking out loud about the idle message. I've talked to machines before. People talk to their cars all the time. Trolls, identified by viewers coming in from other channels, descended on our channel with unqualified, categoric, and polarized statements, such as, "It was pilot suicide, full stop," or "Boeing can't build a safe aircraft," or "This is a cover-up," or "Air India can't run a safe operation." And these trolls have been challenged online, and some have decided to leave this channel on their own accord. Comment was, "Well, I'm out of here." In a few cases, trolls were removed, and moderation will take place on viewers' comments to ensure that there is a rational, scientific, technical discussion. So there are four basic camps on Air India crash of Flight 171. First camp, guilty. The pilot caused the event. The second camp, innocent. Pilot or pilots, plural, did not cause the crash. The third camp, unproven. These people remain neutral. And the fourth camp, the pilots were victims of a systemic complexity. Modern aircraft are growing more and more complex, and operating them and maintaining them is becoming more and more complex. And the job for the pilot is becoming more and more complex. There has been a polarization of the camps. Debate has been polarized even further into Boeing builds perfect aircraft versus look at the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, or Air India perfectly operates and maintains its aircraft versus Air India has a chaotic track record, or the pilots are perfectly innocent versus let's blame the pilots who are no longer here to defend themselves. When a Boeing 787 takes off, the pilot will have many things to consider after rotation and establishing a positive rate of climb. He'll be mindful of the takeoff weight, the ambient temperature, the air density, obstacle clearance, engine performance, wind direction, wind shear, turbulence, bird activity, a long list of things on his mind. And too low an angle of attack or in too high angle of attack, both are potentially dangerous. The pilot will have calculated V2, the safe takeoff speed, and he will have calculated the optimum climb gradient for any particular takeoff. Now, we have neither the full FDR data nor any of the CVR transcript or recording. What we do have is sufficient data from the preliminary report, from Boeing, from the ADS-B data, and the ACARS data in order to reconstruct the flight path to a high degree of certainty. ADS-B altitude is given above mean sea level and based on the standard atmosphere, 1013.25 hectopascal and 15 degrees centigrade. So we've corrected the ADS-B data for the air pressure and temperature locally at Ahmedabad Airport. The runway chart shows the elevation at 180 feet. This is geometric above mean sea level. And the QNH was 1001 hectopascal. That's the air pressure. And the air temperature was 37 degrees centigrade. For VT-ANB on the 12th of June, 2025, the preliminary report states that V2 was calculated at 162 knots, and the aircraft was in a nose-up attitude of 8 degrees when it crashed. And V2 at 162, that means Vmax was well above the takeoff safety speed. The wind given at takeoff clearance was 6 knots from 240 degrees true, and Flight Radar 24 shows 8 ADS-B data points, and the average between the first and the 8th ADS-B shows 178.996 knots, which aligns very closely with the reported Vmax. The runway alignment is 224.6 degrees true. The aircraft track from ADS-B point 1 to point 8 was 223.7 degrees true, and from ADS-8 to the first impact point was 221.7 degrees true. There are several anchor points in the flight of VT-ANB on the 12th of June last year, with known latitudes and longitudes. The roll start point, which I've called RSP, the first ADS-B data point, ADS-B1, the last ADS-B data point, ADS-B8, and the first impact point, which I've called FIP. Now, from the RSP to ADS-B1 was 2,840.6 meters, and that was covered in 69.551 seconds. ADS-B1 to 8 was 397.8 meters and covered in 4.32 seconds, with an altitude gain of 50 feet. That's only to the nearest 25 feet in increments. ADS-8 to the FIP is 1,720.8 meters. That's covered in 22.129 seconds. And ADS-B1 was given as 575 feet in elevation and ADS-B8 in 625 feet. And as I mentioned, these figures are only given to the nearest 25 feet. And there was a shallow climb gradient based on the ADS-B data. The reconstructed trajectory indicates a shallow descending flight path, approximately minus 0.9 degrees, with a nose-up attitude of approximately 8 degrees at impact. The aerodynamic state is consistent with an aircraft attempting to sustain lift during an energy or thrust deficit. The geometry does not reflect a steep nose-down descent profile. The trajectory reflects an optimum glide path, considering full engine thrust would only be achieved around 60 seconds after the successful dual-engine relight, according to Boeing. The aircraft reached approximately Vmax 180 knots ground speed or 185 knots indicated airspeed. Between ADS-B1 and 8, it climbed modestly at a 4% gradient. At ADS-B8, it was only 85 to 90 feet above the runway environment. And from ADS-B8 to the FIP, the aircraft descended shallowly at minus 0.9 degrees. The average descent rate was a modest 230 to 245 feet per minute. Impact occurred in a nose-up 8-degree but descending state. Implied angle of attack at impact was approximately 9 degrees. The trajectory does not reflect a steep dive. The data is consistent with loss of energy state after reaching Vmax, inability to sustain level or positive climb, shallow descending flight into terrain. The engines can be shut down by the pilots or automatically by the aircraft system called the FADEC. The FADEC is the Full Authority Digital Engine Control, and it is part of the engine electronic control system. The FADEC system is continuously monitoring the health of both engines. The FADEC is a protection system and may command shutdown under conditions including number one, an uncontained engine failure or major engine damage. Number two, a multiple fire detection from various fire detection signals with failed fire suppression. Number three, severe internal oil system failures. Number four, over temperature events. Number five, fan or low pressure, high pressure compressor stall with surge and restart failure. Number six, turbine overspeed. And number seven, loss of FADEC redundancy or total control loss. In the case of the Air India Flight 171 crash, the FADEC was able to successfully relight both engines after both engines flamed out. But unfortunately, the thrust was not sufficient in a timely manner to allow the aircraft to gain altitude and start to climb again after the descent from the initial climb had commenced. The core claim made in these viewer comments: the loss of thrust began immediately after the engine fuel control switches moved from run to cutoff, which is the kind of state change pilots can command and which has an obvious and immediate effect: engine shutdown. The AAIB preliminary report describes the fuel cutoff happening seconds after liftoff. Each fuel switch will operate the SPA fuel valve via 28-volt relay and the fuel metering valve via the electronic engine control. The fuel control switches are typically designed with a guarding and locking logic specifically to prevent inadvertent movement. Therefore, an accidental dual cutoff is implausible, pushing the conclusion towards deliberate action or gross error. Both engines being cut off within about a second of each other is argued to be statistically unlikely from simply random bumping. So the conclusion is someone meant to do it. The FADEC allows restart of the engines as long as there was no detection of any catastrophic engine damage, and when the start logic conditions are satisfied, and the fuel supply is restored, and the N2 and N3 rotation is sufficient, and ignition is enabled, and the airflow is adequate. It is also possible to restart the engines either from the cockpit overhead panel or by recycling the fuel switches, which forces the FADEC to restart the engines. Public summaries of the cockpit audio describe one pilot challenging the other, "Why did you cut off fuel?" and the other denying doing so. The official report states, in the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, "Why did he cut off?" The other pilot responded that he did not do so. The word fuel is not mentioned in the official report, but it is mentioned in the media report. Some investigators and media reporting point to the captain. The AAIB preliminary report is a snapshot of early facts and subject to change, and does not apportion blame. The FAA and EASA safety bulletins in 2018 warn that if the locking feature on the fuel switches is disengaged, the switch may be moved without the normal lift action and is exposed to inadvertent operation. explicitly including the risk of unintended in-flight shutdown. The AAIB report notes Air India said the suggested inspections in 2018 were not performed because the bulletin was advisory and not mandatory. Pilot associations publicly rejected narratives of pilot suicide or definitive pilot culpability as reckless and unfounded given the preliminary information. And AAIB states both pilots had adequate rest and passed breath analyzer testing before flight. That is used to push back against impairment narratives. And after the preliminary report, DGCA directed industry-wide check on the fuel switch locking mechanisms, and Air India later reported no issues were found in its fleet check. This is used to argue investigators and regulators considered a hardware locking hypothesis seriously enough to warrant inspection, so blaming pilots is premature. In hearings relating to the probe, India's Supreme Court was quoted as remarking along the lines of, "No one in India believes it was the pilot's fault. No one can blame the pilot." A statement was made in the context of criticizing speculative reporting. And people slide between position one, did the switches move to cutoff? AAIB preliminary report suggests yes, and it was a factual state change of the switch physically. Number two, could a pilot physically have caused that movement? Yes, of course, in principle. Number three, did a pilot do it intentionally or negligently? And that is not established publicly, and that's where the camps diverge. Number four, if a pilot did it, was it because of a design lock vulnerability, ergonomics, startle confusion, or intent? And the intent is completely open. There is no evidence provided on intent. And number five, some are claiming the switches were not physically moved. Only the switch state was changed electrically and digitally. At present, this remains speculative in public information and would require corroboration from an independent acquisition chain. What I next did was create a Bayesian framework. This is a learning curve going through various hypotheses and sets of evidence and working out the probabilities and the likelihoods. So I established four hypotheses. The first one, it was a deliberate crash with intent. So deliberate cutoff intended to disable thrust and crash the aircraft. Hypothesis two was a deliberate action, but with an unknown intent. A pilot deliberately moved both switches to cut off, but not necessarily intending a crash. Number three, an unintentional human act. The switches were moved inadvertently, mistakenly, the startle factor, misidentification, degraded lock, workflow error. And number four, no human initiation. So the event was not a human-initiated mechanism. It was something to do with the hardware, the software, the logic, and a common mode failure. The sets of evidence that I looked at, there were six of them. Number one, the dual thrust loss signature very shortly after liftoff. Number two, both fuel control switches later being returned to run in flight. Number three, the Mayday call and the timing of that call. Number four, the flight path attitude consistent with energy deficit and an attempted lift preservation. Number five, wreckage positions conflict with recorded positions, for example, the thrust levers and the fuel switches. And E5 is best treated as evidence about reliability of wreckage positions and not evidence of intent. And number 6, multi-domain fault cluster, including gateways, ops, flight control module on all channels, taken from the ACAR's report just after engine start. I also added the timing. There are 15 key timing points. The takeoff at 08:08:39.201, and that's a timeline 0. The RAT initiated at 08:08:41, 2 seconds after takeoff. Vmax 180 indicated airspeed, 08:08:42, 3 seconds after takeoff. Then engine 1 fuel switch to cut off at 4 seconds, engine 2 to cut off at 5 seconds after takeoff, ADS-B data point 1 at 8 seconds and 575 feet above mean sea level. Then the RAT hydraulic pump supplying at 08:08:47, 8 seconds. Then the maximum altitude reached, it's ADS-B data point 8, 625 above mean sea level, after 12 seconds. Then the transponder switches off and no more ADS-B data after 08:08:51. Then the engine 1 switch goes back to run 13 seconds after takeoff. The APU inlet door opens at 15 seconds after takeoff. Engine 2 switch goes back to run 17 seconds after takeoff. The Mayday call at 26 seconds after takeoff. And the EAFR stops at 32 seconds after takeoff. The priors are assumptions in the Bayesian model, and I've made them explicit, and I check the sensitivity of these priors. The script includes the entire Bayesian framework and is available for download in the link in the description below. You can, if you don't like my priors and think they're wrong, you can substitute your own and rerun the Bayesian model. My conclusion that deliberate crash intent is disfavored is driven by the recovery evidence, the run reselection, the relight signatures from the engines, the Mayday, and the lift preserving trajectory. Unless you start with an extremely high prior in favor of crash intent, the posterior is still pushed down by evidence. Equal priors aren't inherently neutral in this case because the hypotheses aren't symmetric. Deliberate crash intent is a narrower claim that needs additional assumptions. What were the results from the Bayesian framework analysis? Under the stated assumptions and likelihood assignments, the model output for deliberate crash intent is at around 0.3%. The posterior probabilities, so for a deliberate crash with intent, 0.3%, deliberate act and unknown intent, 6%, an unintentional human act, 50%, and a non-human initiation, 43%. So based on currently available public evidence, the deliberate crash intent is very low, and a deliberate act with unknown intent is also low. However, an unintentional human act is moderate, and a non-human initiation is also moderate. We then applied a sensitivity analysis to the Bayesian results. We only varied the prior on the deliberate crash intent. The remaining prior mass is redistributed across the other hypotheses in the same proportion as the baseline priors. The run reselection and relight signatures and Mayday and the lift preserving trajectory are treated exactly as before, a penalty against the entire guilty family, not distinguishing between the other hypotheses. The model mainly distinguishes between the deliberate versus the non-deliberate, and it does not strongly separate crash intent from other deliberate actions without the CVR intent evidence. We're showing a table of the various sensitivity analysis changes. The current available data disfavors a deliberate crash intent. The real debate space is now technical, not moral. Was the cutoff human-initiated, deliberate or inadvertent? Or was it system-initiated? And that's a narrower and more technical discussion. There is already a sufficient answer, in my view, at this stage, and that without further FDR and CVR data. However, if we want to take this analysis further and clarify exactly what happened, we would need the following FDR and CVR data. Evidence A, the FADEC EEC logs, which would explicitly show why the engine shut down, and it was due to the fuel control switch being moved or another cause, a prior electrical or data link loss. Evidence B, the FADEC logs would show shutdown due to internal protection and not a switch trigger. Evidence C, the full CVR context, will show either a calm, purposeful language indicating intent, or shows startle and confusion and competing tasks and misidentification patterns. And finally, a physical exam bench test would show whether the lock mechanism was compromised on the fuel switches and the lift to move was defeated. An independent confirmation of the switch date from a second source and not the same acquisition chain. In conclusion, given the publicly available evidence, the likelihood that the cause of the Air India 171 crash on the 12th of June 2025 was a deliberate action by one or both of the pilots is very low. The likelihood that it was a deliberate action, but with an unknown intent, is also low. The most likely causes are either an unintentional human act or the cause had no human initiation, and both of those are with moderate possibility. To finally determine the probable cause of the accident, the FDR and CVR data must be released publicly. And that is exactly why the petition in the Supreme Court of India has called for the release of that data. Many thanks for watching, and please, I invite you to bring your comments and questions on this episode, and we will attempt to answer those in the next episode, which is due to be released on Friday.